The year was 2091. Outside, the air had turned corrosive, and the sun only appeared twice a month, filtered through thick copper skies like a dying filament. Inside the colonies, society was structured not by status or money, but by clarity index, a psychological metric that measured emotional coherence and cognitive transparency. Every citizen had a score. The higher your clarity, the more privileges you had: access to unfiltered literature, private quarters, daylight lamps. The lower your score, the more surveillance you endured. Privacy had become a relic of an irrational past. In Colony 9A, Sector 12, lived a man named Idris Vale. Technically, Idris was a calibrator, a mid-tier employee whose job was to help others align their inner states with their outward behaviors. The process was called cognitive synchrony auditing. Most hated it. Idris didn't. He was good at it. He had no family, no social bonds outside work. He didn't drink, didn't dream, didn't diverge. His clarity index was precisely 81.2, high enough to avoid scrutiny, low enough to avoid notice. Then came Subject 9142. Her name was Sarah Kaur. She'd been marked for partial reconditioning, a subtle form of psycho-realignment reserved for those who showed mild but consistent dissonance. Sarah's clarity index fluctuated too often. Her logs showed minor behavioral contradictions, pausing too long before speaking, shifting her gaze downward when recalling facts, slight delays in moral preference simulations, nothing illegal, just unsettling. Idris was assigned her case. Their first session was standard. He asked her to recount a routine incident, retrieving a parcel from the distribution pod. She answered, clearly, calmly. But her voice, it was fractured in ways no AI would flag. Not broken, bent, like someone who was folding meaning inward. You hesitated, he noted. I did, she said unapologetically. I was considering whether the memory still belonged to me. Idris made a note on his tactile pad. That wasn't a scripted response. It wasn't even adaptive. He ended the session early. Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah returned for 11 sessions. Each one deviated slightly further from protocol. Sometimes she would ask him questions about the room, about the patterns on his shirt. Once, she asked whether he thought silence was a form of truth or a refusal of it. He reported none of this, not because he sympathized, but because he couldn't quite predict where it was going. He kept telling himself the goal was not to understand her, it was to recalibrate her. Yet after each session, Idris felt imprecise, not disturbed, just slightly off axis, like his own clarity was shifting by fractions too small to measure. One evening, after their 12th meeting, he found a note slipped into the fold of his neural ledger. It read, "You're not what your score says you are. Neither am I. It wasn't signed, but it didn't have to be. Protocol was clear. Personal messaging between auditor and subject was grounds for administrative review. Still, Idris said nothing. The next time she arrived, he didn't mention the note. She didn't either. Instead, she asked, "What would happen if I stopped answering your questions?" "You'd be flagged." "And if I kept coming?" "Eventually, you'd be recalibrated more forcefully." She looked at him, not defiantly, not with contempt, just openly, the way people might have looked at each other when such things were still permitted. "You're not afraid of being flagged, are you?" she asked. He paused. Something deep in his sternum, a place that had long atrophied, stirred. "I am," he replied, "but not in the way you think." The day after that session, she didn't come, nor the day after. On the third day, he searched the registry. Her record had been cleared. No note, no relocation tag, no neural logs archived. She was gone. That night, Idris walked through the lower corridors of Sector 12, a place he'd never wandered before. He knew the scanners wouldn't pick him up. He'd learned where the blind spots were years ago, long before he needed them. At the end of a narrow hallway, he found an old metal access door, unregistered, partially rusted. A code was scratched into it. Numbers, yes, but not random. They were clarity scores, and all of them below 40, as if someone had been keeping track of the discarded. He stood there for a long time. Then, without knowing why, he erased his own score from his wrist terminal. The numbers blinked twice, then vanished, leaving behind a blank space where his identity used to live. No warning, no confirmation request, just silence. For a moment he expected something to happen. Alarms, sirens, a tightening in the walls around him, but nothing moved. The colony remained still, indifferent. Idris stood there, his wrist bare, the hum of the corridor pressing against his ears like static. The absence of the score was louder than any number had ever been. He turned to face the unregistered metal door again. This time, he didn't hesitate. The keypad accepted manual input. No biometric verification, no neural ping. As if it too had been waiting for someone who didn't belong. The door creaked open. Behind it, the air shifted, less filtered, less conditioned, warmer. Flickering lights bounced off old metal beams and walls painted with words, real words, handwritten in chalk and ink, phrases that made no sense to the system. Disobedience of presence. Clarity is not truth. To be seen is to exist. He stepped inside. It wasn't a passage. It wasn't a tunnel. It was a space, an interval between system and self, between monitoring and memory. a gathering point for those who had erased themselves not to vanish but to begin. People were there, not many, but enough to prove the silence outside had been lying. One of them looked up. She didn't smile, but she nodded. And he understood. Sarah hadn't disappeared. She had crossed. And now he had too. And the moral of this story is, trust doesn't always arrive with answers. Sometimes it slips quietly between the cracks of compliance and lingers where control no longer reaches.